Welcome to Decoded by Christina, a series where each video will focus on one HTML or CSS concept. Today, I'm going to talk about working with text and background images, and how to use CSS to create a color overlay. Let's get started. Using images on a web page helps to add visual interest, but figuring out how to place text on top of the image while making sure you can still read it can be challenging. There are a few different ways to get around this issue. The easiest option is to use images that have a big blank area for your text or doesn't have a lot of detail. If you don't have your own photos, there are plenty of free and paid options for stock photography. Another option is to use an image editing program like Photoshop to darken or lighten the image. I usually just add a black or white background color on a layer and then change the opacity of the image to my liking, then save the new image. You can also add a color overlay if you want. Or sometimes, even desaturating the photo and making it black and white can help make the text stand out. But if you're using a lot of photos, or maybe you want to change the color of the overlay later on, it might get cumbersome to update it using image editing software. If you are making edits to images, it's best to avoid adding text to the image itself. For the visually impaired, screen readers are used to read out the text in the HTML. And if the text is in the image, then it can't be read aloud. And you want your web pages to be as accessible as possible. While you can and should add an alt attribute to your images, this is used for describing the actual image itself. And most of the time, when working with text and images, the image file is added as a background image using the CSS background or background image property. So you won't even be able to add an alt attribute. So just avoid doing it altogether. Luckily, there are ways to work with text and background images using different CSS properties and techniques. Let's take a look at an example. If you'd like to follow along, the link to this Codepen is in the description below. Also note that when using Codepen, it auto-refreshes when making changes to the code, so you don't have to save or reload the page to see the updates. But if you want to save your work and keep a copy, then select the fork option and make sure you have an account. Now that my Codepen is all set up, let's try making a change. Sometimes just adjusting the text color with the color property will do the trick. Let's try uncommenting this style for the H1 and the P tag by deleting the slash and asterisk, or use the keyboard shortcut, Command// on a Mac or Control/ on a PC. If the image is mostly dark, use a white or light color to add contrast, or vice versa if the image is mostly lighter colors. In this example, the heading is in an area of the image that has less detail, so the color change kind of works, but the paragraph text is still hard to read. Sometimes adding a drop shadow can help too. Let's try adding the text shadow property. This might work depending on the image, but it doesn't always go well with more detailed images. Plus, it can be tricky to add a drop shadow to longer blocks of text or smaller font sizes. To learn more about how to use this property, check out my text shadow video. Another option is to use the background property. I'll just comment out these styles so we can try adding some alternative background styles instead. With this property, we can add the color directly to the element or an element containing the text. In this example, I'll start by using the Longhand property, background-color, and add it directly to the H1 tag and the div containing all the paragraphs. To have more of the background image showing through, add some transparency using an RGBA value instead of a keyword or hex code. An RGB value will display a solid color by specifying the red, green, and blue values, with each value separated by a comma. 0 represents black and 255 represents white. All other colors are a combination of the remaining numbers. The values in this example, 70, 130, and 180, will display a shade of blue. To add some transparency, make sure to use the RGBA value to specify the alpha channel. Any value between 0 and 1 can be used. 0 is fully transparent and 1 is solid. Or use a percentage value. For example, 0.8 is the same as 80%. You can find RGB values using image editing software like Photoshop or various online resources. I like this one, colors.neilorangepeel.com. You can browse through a bunch of different colors, find the RGB values, and their corresponding keyword and hex values if you need them. If you already have a color and just need to convert it to RGB, there are tools such as rgb.to where you can add your value and convert it. To learn more about all the different types of color values, check out the extra resources listed in the video description. While adding transparency to your background colors can be useful, this technique may not provide the effect you're looking for. Text-based elements are usually block-level elements, so they span the full width of their container. Adding a background color to it will add the color all the way across the container, even if the text doesn't span all the way across, as you can see with the heading in this example. There is a workaround using the display value. If I set it to inline block for the H1 heading, it'll reduce the width of the element to the size of its content and stay on its own line, combining the behaviors of both inline and block level elements. And since the background color is added to the element itself, it will now be applied accordingly. The extra space on the top and bottom of the H1 element is actually coming from the default line height, which is the space between the lines of text. If I set that to 1, it will make the line height of the element the same size as the text, removing the extra space. Most of the time, you want to keep that line height to make blocks of text easier to read. For example, if I set it to 1 for the paragraph, which has text spanning over multiple lines, the text will be too close together, making it harder to read. But even with the H1, removing the line height makes everything look all squished. So I would suggest adding some padding to increase the space within the element to even out the look of the spacing on all sides. I'll go with 12 pixels. Adding one value here will add the same amount of padding space on all 4 sides. You might be wondering, why did I remove the space just to add in more space? Well, by removing the line height, it gives us more control over the space we add back in. If I remove this line height style, the padding will be added to the default line height space. Sometimes it's the small subtle changes that can make all the difference. This style may be what you need, depending on what you're trying to achieve. But this technique only adds a background color to the specific element. Use the background image property to add a color overlay to the entire image itself. Here's how it works. Multiple background images can be used by separating the values with a comma. The images will then be displayed stacked on top of each other. The background image property can also be used to create a gradient. There are many CSS gradient data types that can be used to transition between 2 or more colors. You can also use these CSS function values to create a gradient in different directions. The colors can change from top to bottom, from the center spanning outward, or even be displayed as repeated patterns. I'll be using the linear gradient function to add a color overlay on top of the background image. Make sure to define the gradient value first, then the image, since the first value displays on top. Let's add this to the example. I'm going to remove the previous background styles to add in the gradient background image style instead. Since this technique requires using multiple values, start with the gradient so it can show on top and separate the 2 values with a comma. Because the values for this style can be kind of long, I like to put the 2 different values on its own line, just to make it easier to read. This is just my personal preference for formatting this type of declaration. A gradient function requires at least 2 color values to transition from one color to another to create the gradient effect. I've added a black overlay using the RGBA color value to add some transparency as well. The first value is the top of the gradient. The second value is the bottom of the gradient. You can also use the same color for both values if you don't want a gradient effect. Because the RGBA value requires using parentheses, which is contained within the linear gradient function, which also uses parentheses, it's easy to accidentally be short a bracket or have too many. So just be sure to double check your syntax. There should be one here and here for the RGBA values, and the opening bracket for the linear gradient function starts here and ends here. Now that I've added a dark overlay on top of the image, I can go back to using a light color for the text. Instead of using pure white, which is the 3Fs hex code, I like to bump it down a bit and use 3Es or even 3Ds to make it an almost white color. It's a subtle difference, and if you can't see the difference, no worries, it's just my personal preference. If you want to keep the gradient effect, you can choose different colors or just change the opacity. Now, you can tweak and experiment with the color overlay as you please without the need to make any changes to the image file itself. So far, I've been using the Longhand background property in these examples. If you wanted to use other background properties in addition to the image, here's how to do it using the Longhand syntax. This is an example using two background images. Let's say we also want to add the background repeat and background position values. Each property should be declared with two values, separated by a comma and in the same order as the images. So for the background repeat and background position property in this example, the first values are applied to the first background image, and same goes for the second values. To use the shorthand syntax, the styles can be written using just the background property, and all the different values associated with the particular image are only separated by a space, not a comma. Add the comma after to add a second background image and its associated background styles. In most cases, it's best to reduce the amount of CSS that you're writing as much as possible. But with some properties that have more detailed rules for shorthand syntax, it may be more clear to use the longhand syntax, especially if you're just starting out and still learning. You'll become more efficient as you write more CSS. That wraps up this edition of Decoded by Christina. Remember to check the description for the links to all the references I've mentioned throughout the video and for some extra resources. If you're interested in taking a full-on course, check out my CSS Essential Training course on LinkedIn Learning. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to get updates. Until next time, bye!